A man can survive a desert or a war, but he rarely survives the mistake of thinking he is the hardest thing in the room. Dodge City didn't belong to the mayor or the men wearing stars in 1882. It belonged to three brothers, and every soul in town knew the price of forgetting it. Every soul, that is, except for the stranger who rode in on a Tuesday morning and picked the wrong place to sit for a cup of coffee. That summer, Dodge City was a place that had earned every inch of its dark reputation. It was the end of the line for the Texas cattle drives. Cowboys arrived with 1,000 miles of dust in their lungs and pockets heavy with trail pay. The town was loud, violent, and profitable. Those three things always draw a certain breed of man. Most of them had moved on or found a permanent home in the dirt. Three of them remained. The Cord brothers, Wade, Holt, and a young pup they called Reno, had arrived 4 years prior. They brought a history of violence from 3 other territories and the cold ambition of men who decided that moving on was for those without the nerve to stay. They stayed. They took whatever they wanted. 11 men had been confirmed dead by their hands in 4 years, and likely more that the Kansas wind had covered up. Dodge City had learned to live with them, the way a body lives with a bullet it can't cut out. You don't get better, you just learn to work around the pain. The marshal, Ike Toiver, had been a brave man once. He still carried the memory of it like an old photograph, but he kept his peace. He enforced the laws that wouldn't get him buried and ignored the ones that would. The Cords were the law he chose to ignore. The town had accepted this arrangement, but nobody told the man on the horse. The stranger rode Scout into town just past 8 o'clock. Tuesday was the closest thing to quiet Dodge City ever saw. He noticed 3 things within the first 2 minutes. People moved with the careful, shifting eyes of those who are always tracking a predator. 3 horses stood outside the Lucky Dice saloon at sunrise, men who had been drinking since the day before. And Scout's ears were pinned back, alert and twitching. The horse knew the air was heavy before the man did. He tied Scout at the far end of the street, well away from the Lucky Dice saloon horses. He picked a spot that gave the animal a clear view in 4 directions. He settled the horse with a firm hand on the neck and walked toward the smell of coffee. 11 men had accidentally sat at Wade Cord's table over the years. All 11 had stood up and begged for their lives. The stranger was just looking for a drink. Wade Cord was 38 years old and built like a stone barn. He had pale blue eyes that went flat and dead when his temper rose, a look that told anyone with sense to be somewhere else immediately. Wade walked into Hannigan's diner at 8:15 with his brothers at his back. He stopped dead when he saw a man sitting in his chair. Holt Cord, the middle brother, was 34 and lean as a winter wolf. He was a man of cold efficiency who had learned that a fast draw was better than a loud mouth. He stopped beside Wade and read the tension in the room in a single, practiced glance. Reno Cord was 26 years of kinetic energy and poor judgment. He stepped into the back of Holt because he wasn't watching his path. He never was. The stranger sat at the back table. He didn't look up from his newspaper. Wade Cord walked over and stood like a shadow over the wood. He said nothing. He preferred the kind of silence that broke most men before a word was even spoken. The stranger finally looked at him. Wade spoke first. Quote, 0. The stranger didn't flinch. "There are other tables," he said. He went back to his reading. The air in Hannigan's diner turned thin and cold. The other customers suddenly found the floorboards and the ceiling fascinating, anything to avoid looking at the back of the room. Hannigan gripped his counter with both hands. He was trying to shrink without moving a muscle. Quote, _2__, Wade said. The stranger turned a page. The sound of the paper was like a gunshot in the quiet. Quote 3. Holt put a steadying hand on Wade's arm. Quote 4. Holt said softly. Quote 5. Wade stared at the man for a long moment. He saw the frayed poncho, the dusty hat kept on indoors, the way the man held the paper with hands that did not shake. Wade agreed. They moved to a different spot. Reno pulled out a chair and sat across from the man anyway. He had the grin of a man who thought he was charming because no one had ever dared to slap it off his face. Reno said, The stranger looked at Reno over the top of the news. He stared for exactly 3 seconds. Reno's grin lasted for 2. Quote 9, the stranger said. He went back to the paper. Reno stood and walked back to his brothers. He whispered something to Holt. Holt looked back at the table. His expression shifted. It became something sharper and more calculated. It was the look of a man marking a grave for later. The coffee arrived. The stranger drank it slow. He paid his tab, folded the paper, and stepped out into the morning Texas sun. He walked straight to the shop of the undertaker. Pruitt looked up as the door creaked. He performed the quick math of his trade. He saw the wear on the denim, the low hang of the gun, the heavy stillness that followed the man inside. Pruitt had seen that look before. It was never the herald of a long life. Quote 10, the undertaker asked. The stranger scanned the room. He looked at the finished pine boxes. He looked at the workbench and the ledger. Quote 11, the stranger said. Pruitt waited for a name. Quote 12. Quote 13, Pruitt asked. The stranger stopped at the door. He turned just enough to catch the light. Quote 14. He stepped out. Pruitt stood in the silence of his shop for a long time. He looked at his tools and his wood. Then he started to measure. In Dodge City, news travels like a prairie fire. By 2 in the afternoon, the order reached the Lucky Dice Saloon. The stranger knew it would. In a town where 3 brothers controlled every breath taken, information moved toward them like water down a drain. He was counting on it. Men often trade their souls for a little peace, but the debt always comes due. Before we see who pays the bill, tell me something. Where are you riding along from today? The stranger has left the dust of Dust Creek and the cold winds of Cold Creek behind. Now he stands in Dodge City. 3 men are about to learn that sitting at the wrong table was their final mistake. Drop your country in the comments. Let us see how far this trail reaches. Now, back to Dodge City. Back to a lawman who made a choice 4 years ago and is about to be asked for a new one. Ike Toiver was 51 years old. He had the hollow look of a man who had spent years trying to become invisible. He sat behind his desk when the stranger stepped inside. Toiver looked up with the eyes of a man who knew that unexpected guests never bring good news. The stranger offered no greeting. Quote 15. Quote, he said. Quote 16. Quote. Toiver's face shifted in a way that told everything without saying a word. Quote 17. The stranger asked. Quote 18. Toiver whispered. Quote 19. Toiver looked down at his own hands. Toiver said. The stranger remained silent for a long moment. Toiver blinked, confused. The stranger gave a slow nod. He said nothing more. Something in the marshal's face broke. It was as if he had waited 4 years for someone to ask that question and not judge him for the answer. The wall clock ticked toward 4 like a hammer on a coffin nail. There is a family, Toiver said, his voice reaching for air. The Garretts, a father and 2 daughters. They owned the only business in town the brothers didn't control. Wade Cord wanted the older daughter. She refused him. Toiver stopped. That was 2 weeks ago. Quote 30. Quote, the stranger said. Quote 31. Quote, Toiver watched him. Quote 32. Quote 33. Quote 34. Toiver counted. Quote 35. Quote, the stranger stood up. Quote 36. Quote 37. Quote, the stranger replied. Quote 38. Quote, at 4 o'clock, the Cord brothers will decide how to handle those 3 coffins. That choice will determine how many of them walk out of Dodge City. He stepped back out onto Front Street. Toiver sat at his desk for a long minute. Then he began to write a telegram. The Garrett Freight Company sat at the south end of Front Street. It was a large building with double doors meant for loaded wagons. 3 freight haulers waited in the yard. Clara Garrett was 24 years old. She had the sharp edge of someone who had been living in fear for 2 weeks. She had turned that fear into something more efficient. "I spoke with Ike Toiver," the stranger said. "He talks to a lot of people," Clara replied. "It hasn't helped us yet." "I know." He took a seat across from her. She told him every detail. She did not trust him. She simply had no other choices left. And this was a man who did not carry the scent of the Cord brothers on him. Pride is a debt that most men can't afford to pay. Wade Cord didn't want the freight business for the money. He wanted it because Clara Garrett had looked him in the eye and said no. In Wade's world, that word didn't exist. He had spent 4 years building a kingdom where his will was the only law. Clara stood in the office and watched the man before her. "Quote 43, the stranger asked. She didn't hesitate. 4 regulars, maybe 2 more they can call on. She let the silence hang between them. "That's 9 against 1, counting the brothers." The stranger didn't flinch. "Quote 46, quote," he said quietly. Clara studied his face for a long moment. She asked. He said. He stood up with a slow, deliberate grace. He stepped back out onto the dust of Front Street. Clara watched him through the glass. He moved north toward the Lucky Dice Saloon. His stride was unhurried. It was the walk of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in weeks. It wasn't quite hope. It was something harder, something more durable. It was the feeling that the arithmetic was about to change. He spent the morning dissecting Dodge City. He didn't look at it like a traveler. He looked at it like a soldier. He mapped the rooftops and the narrow gaps between buildings. He identified the choke points and the hidden lines of fire. Scout tracked his movement from the hitching post. The horse watched with dark, specific eyes. They had a partnership built on a dozen different battlefields, one difficult situation at a time. Inside the hardware store, the air smelled of oil and cold iron. Raw stood behind the counter. He had spent 4 years watching the Cord brothers. He studied them like a man studying the machine that was crushing him. Raw knew the patterns. He knew which of the regulars would pull the trigger first. He knew Wade was the ego and Reno was the spark. But Holt was the brain. Holt was the one who kept them alive. Raw kept his eyes on the street while they spoke. "You ordered 3 coffins," Raw whispered. "Good. Wade's pride won't let him stay inside." He looked at the stranger. "You're just one man." "I know that too." "Why do this?" Raw asked. It wasn't a challenge. He truly wanted to know. __quote _ 57 __. The stranger looked out at the sun-bleached street. "Quote 58, he said. "Quote 59. Raw leaned in closer. "Quote 60. "Quote 61, the stranger said. "Quote 62. "Quote 63. He walked out into the heat. At 2 o'clock he moved Scout. He led the horse away from Front Street. He tucked him into the alley behind Raw's hardware store. It was the best tactical position in the city. A horse could move fast in 3 directions from there. Scout entered the shadows without being led. He sensed the purpose in the stranger's movement. He put a steady hand on the horse's neck. He felt the warmth of the animal's skin. "I need you ready," he whispered. "Not out there, just ready." Scout stood perfectly still. That was the only answer he needed. He knew they were coming at 4 o'clock. He could almost smell the gunpowder already. He knew because Raw sent a boy to find him at 3:30. He also knew because Scout shifted in the alley long before the boy appeared. 30 minutes remained. Every passing second felt heavy as a cocked hammer on a colt. A horse reads the air before the eyes see the threat. That early warning had saved them both more times than he could count. He stepped onto Front Street at 5 minutes to 4. The street had emptied, with the cold efficiency of a town used to blood. Dodge City had perfected this collective disappearing act over 4 long years. Within minutes, Front Street was a ghost of itself. There was only the dust, the sun, and the Lucky Dice Saloon at the north end. The 4 o'clock sun hung long and golden. It threw his shadow ahead of him like a pointing finger. Here is a truth about the gunfighters of the frontier. The men who survived were not always the fastest. Speed was a factor, but only one part of the equation. What separated the living from the dead was rarely the draw itself. It was the decision made before the hand ever moved. It was the reading of the field. It was the understanding of which target to break first and why. A fast draw aimed at the wrong man was just a quick way to die. A methodical shooter who decided his sequence early was something far more dangerous. The stranger had settled his sequence at 3:30. The gallery man would be first. Cutter would be second. The two at the saloon entrance would be third and fourth. Then Reno. Then Holt. Wade would be last. Wade needed to see it all before he truly understood. He heard them before he saw them. The Cord brothers came from the north end of Front Street. They walked three abreast, with the theatrical spacing of men who enjoyed the intimidation. Wade held the center. Holt and Reno walked to his right. 4 regulars were positioned at the corners. 7 men, 1 street, 1 target. The brothers stopped 30 feet away. Wade looked at the man standing alone in the dirt. He said he heard that someone had ordered coffins. "I did," the stranger replied. Wade asked how many. 3, the stranger said. Wade smiled with eyes that remained flat and pale. He told the man it was the wrong number. "I do not think so," the stranger answered. Wade gave the nod to Cutter. But the gallery man moved first. He had the angle and he knew it. He took his shot before the talking was even finished. He missed. He missed because the stranger had already moved. A single step to the left changed the math completely. The bullet hit the dirt. In that same motion, the iron was out. The gallery man was finished before his own echo faded. 1. Cutter came off the water trough fast. He was an experienced hand. He got a shot off that hissed past the stranger's left ear, but the return shot was already traveling. 2. The 2 men at the saloon entrance broke their positions the moment Cutter fell. Their discipline broke exactly as predicted. One moved left and the other moved right. In the space their separation created, 2 shots rang out. It took only the time of a single breath. 3. 4. 4 men were down in under 5 seconds. Speed is a fickle master. It grants a man a sense of divinity right up until the lead finds his vitals. Reno Cord was fast. He was genuinely, terrifyingly quick, perhaps the most lethal hand the stranger had encountered in a long time. But Reno's problem was his own confidence. He knew he was fast. That certainty made him commit to the kill before he'd finished reading the man across from him. The stranger shifted his weight the moment Reno's shoulder dipped. The shot went 2 feet wide. The return shot found its mark. That made 5. Reno Cord sat down in the dust of Front Street. His gun lay forgotten in the dirt. His career was over. Most everything else was finishing up too. Holt Cord hadn't flinched since the dance began. He stood perfectly still, watching the violence with the flat eyes of a man running ledger numbers. 5 men broken in 10 seconds. The math was settling in. The stranger caught the micro-shift in Holt's stance. He saw the subtle drop of the right shoulder. It was the beginning of Holt's last remaining angle, but the stranger's muzzle moved to Holt before the man's hand could clear an inch of leather. Their eyes locked across 30 feet of bitter gun smoke. It was a long, heavy moment. Holt Cord finished the calculation he'd been running for 4 years. This time, the result was different. He raised both hands into the air. He let his gun belt clatter onto the street. That made 6. That left only Wade. And Wade Cord wasn't a man who knew how to be finished. The look on his face wasn't his usual cold anger. It was something raw, the look of a man watching his world burn in under 10 seconds. He drew. He was slow. He'd always relied on Reno for speed and Holt for the plan. Without them, he was just a man out of time. He knew it the moment his hand moved. You could see the realization in his eyes. He'd finally run out of road. The stranger shot the revolver clean out of Wade's hand. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was pure precision. Wade's gun hit the dust. He just stared at his empty fingers. The stranger walked toward him through the settling smoke. his stride as unhurried as a Sunday morning. Quote 66, he said quietly. Quote 67. Wade looked at Holt with his hands raised. He looked at Reno on the ground. He looked at Cutter and the gallery man, who weren't getting up again. He sat down in the grit of Front Street and put his hands up. The silence after a gunfight is a heavy thing. It's the sound of a town releasing a breath it's been holding for years. Dodge City let it go. The doors began to open. The shopkeepers were the first to step out. Then came the others, filling Front Street to witness the change. Ike Toiver appeared from his office, walking with more purpose than he'd shown in 4 long years. The afternoon light caught the silver of his badge. There was something in his face that had been gone a long time. It was back now. The world didn't look exactly as it had before he'd started his grim arithmetic, but it was close enough to something a man could live with. He cinched the irons around Wade Cord's wrists. No words, no ceremony, just the cold, final click of justice. Then came Holt Cord. He took the steel with the quiet stillness of a gambler who knew he'd played his last hand and lost. Reno was still among the living, though barely. The doctor arrived and set to work, his hands steady as he tried to keep the youngest Cord's soul lashed to his body. It was a mercy Reno hadn't earned, but he'd get it anyway, because that is the burden of a healer. Pruitt the undertaker emerged from the shadow of his shop. He walked to where Cutter lay, then moved to the gallery man. He made his quiet count, looked up at the dust of Front Street, and ran the numbers one more time. He looked at the stranger. 2, Pruitt said, not 3. Wait for the territorial judge, the stranger replied. Pruitt didn't catch the meaning. Not yet. The judge arrived on the evening stage, and it wasn't by chance. A telegram had been sent when the sun was low that morning. The stranger had known the moment he stepped into Toiver's office that a gun only clears the room. It's the paper that keeps the ghosts from coming back. The territorial judge spent the night reading through 4 years of rot. He looked over the evidence and heard the new testimony of Rohr and Hannigan and a dozen others. They had been waiting 4 years for a man to ask the right questions. Wade Cord was convicted on 3 counts of murder, the 3 that carried the most weight, and sentenced to stretch a rope. Pruitt began work on that 3rd coffin the following week. He'd been right to keep his saw sharp. 3 boxes. The stranger's math had been right from the start. Clara Garrett was waiting at the door of the freight office when he came to say his piece. She had heard the reports. All of Dodge City had heard them. She'd counted the shots and reached her own conclusions. Her face held the look of a woman who had finally reached the end of a long, dark road. "My father," she said, "we will have the business waiting when he recovers. Toiver will keep the peace until then. He is remembering how to be a lawman." "Thank you," she said. She knew it was a small word for a big debt, but she said it anyway. He walked to the narrow alley behind Rohr's hardware store. Scout was there, standing exactly where he'd been left. The horse was attentive, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes as he approached. He checked the animal's legs, checked the water, and swung into the seat. Rohr appeared at the alley's mouth. He stood there for a long moment, and then simply raised a hand, palm out. It was the gesture of a man who had no words left, and so offered the silence instead. High in a window at the east end of Front Street, a silhouette stood behind the glass. Tom Garrett was sitting up in the bed where they said he'd never rise again. He watched the man on the raw-boned horse move through the fading afternoon light. He didn't know the stranger's name. He only knew his daughter was safe, his life's work was standing, and the men who had bled this town for 4 years were waiting for the gallows. That was enough. That was more than enough. Scout turned his nose north. "I have told stories of men who go looking for a fight, men who hunt for glory, and men who would kill for a handful of gold. The stranger in Dodge City was none of those. He was something simpler and much harder to find. He was a man who looked for what was broken and stayed until it was fixed. Не потому, что он искал славы или чувствовал праведный гнев. Просто он не мог допустить, чтобы правда осталась за такими, как братья Корт. Он слишком долго прожил в мире, построенном на их правилах, и больше не желал дышать с ними одним воздухом. Над прерией раскинулось бесконечное небо. В конце ясного дня оно полыхало, перетекая из чистого золота в густой янтарь, а затем в кроваво-красный всполох перед самой темнотой. 3 гроба. Он не ошибся в счете. Он никогда не ошибался, когда дело касалось смерти. В Додж-Сити никто не мог этого объяснить, да и желающих копаться в таких вещах не нашлось. Скаут пошел шагом на север. За их спинами догорал горизонт. Где-то впереди, а впереди всегда что-то есть, его уже поджидало новое дело. Позади остались 4 города. Даст-Крик в полдень, где его ждали 5 стволов. Лошадь, брошенная подыхать в раскаленной пустыне.
Колд-Крик, где 2 бродяг на крыльце салуна совершили свою последнюю ошибку в жизни. И Додж-Сити, где 3 возомнили себя хозяевами Фронт-Стрит, но узнали горькую правду всего за 10 секунд. Прежде чем мы расстанемся, скажите мне вот что. В какой части света вы сейчас слушаете этот рассказ? Напишите свою страну в комментариях, посмотрим, как далеко тянется наш след. И если вы готовы скакать дальше, следующая история уже ждет вас на экране. Включайте ее. Встретимся на тропе.